From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
Because boycott, divestment, and sanctions have no place in my home state and no place in America.
U.S. lawmakers are seeking to criminally outlaw support for the boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign against Israel. If a proposed bipartisan law is passed, backers of BDS could face up to 20 years in prison and $1 million fine. We'll speak to Rabbi Joseph Berman of Jewish Voice for Peace. Then Special Counsel Robert Mueller is expanding his probe to look at President Trump's business activities as well as those of his associates, including his son-in-law Jared Kushner. We'll look at how Kushner tried and failed to get a $500 million bailout from Qatar. Did that failed deal influence how Trump is handling the Gulf diplomatic crisis? We'll speak with Ryan Grimm of The Intercept. Then to Made in America Week.
We want to build, create, and grow more products in our country using American labor, American goods, and American grit.
While President Trump touts American-made products, we'll look at life inside a clothing factory in Indonesia, where Ivanka Trump brand clothing is made. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The special counsel tasked with investigating ties between Donald Trump's campaign and Russia's government during last year's election is examining a broad range of transactions involving Trump's businesses as well as those of his associates. That's according to Bloomberg News, which reported Thursday former FBI Chief Robert Mueller's probe will examine a series of real estate deals with Russian investors, as well as the 2013 Miss Universe pageant in Moscow. The probe has also reportedly absorbed a money laundering investigation into Trump's former campaign chair, Paul Manafort. News of the special counsel's wider investigation came after President Trump left open the possibility he could order the Justice Department to fire Mueller. Trump told the New York Times Mueller would be crossing a red line if he investigates Trump family finances. The Times reports Trump's lawyers and aides are working to dig up dirt on Mueller and his team in an effort to discredit the investigation. Meanwhile, the Washington Post reports Trump was especially upset after learning Mueller would have access to years' worth of Trump's tax returns, which the president has refused to make public. The Washington Post says Trump is also considering future pardons for his family and possibly even himself. This all comes amidst a shakeup of the legal team representing President Trump. Mark Kasowitz will no longer serve as Trump's lead personal attorney. The move follows an expletive-laden series of threats Kasowitz sent by email to a stranger who said he should resign. In Iraq, newly revealed intelligence reports claim more than 40,000 civilians died in the U.S.-led battle to retake Mosul from ISIS, a total far higher than previously reported. Writing for The Independent, Patrick Coburn cited intelligence reports seen by a top Kurdish official who said previous estimates of the deaths were low because thousands of bodies remain buried in the rubble. The battle, which wrapped up earlier this month, began last October and lasted months longer than the siege of Stalingrad during World War II. Back in the U.S., civil rights groups are warning a pair of bipartisan bills would criminalize free speech and peaceful protests. The Israel Anti-Boycott Act would make it a felony for U.S. citizens to support boycotts of Israel and Israeli settlements, punishable by at least a $250,000 fine with a maximum penalty of 20 years in prison and a fine of $1 million. So far, 43 senators and 234 Congress members on both sides of the aisle support the legislation. The American Israel Public Affairs Committee, or AIPAC, reportedly helped craft the bill and has made its passage one of the group's top lobbying priorities for the year. In a letter on Monday, the American Civil Liberties Union wrote, quote, "We take no position for or against the effort to boycott Israel or any foreign country, for that matter. However, we do assert that the government cannot, consistent with the First Amendment, punish U.S. persons based solely on their express political beliefs," unquote. The attempt to criminalize the BDS movement comes amidst a deepening humanitarian crisis in the Gaza Strip, where the United Nations said this month conditions have become unlivable. The Senate Judiciary Committee voted 20-0 Thursday to recommend President Trump's nominee replace James Comey as head of the FBI, clearing the way for Christopher Wray to be approved by the full Senate. Wray served as Assistant Attorney General under George W. Bush from 2003 to 2005, at a time when the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel signed off on the torture of prisoners in CIA and military custody. The Justice Department said this week it will allow state and local police departments to seize cash and property from people suspected of crimes, even if they haven't been convicted. Attorney General Jeff Sessions says the policy, called civil asset forfeiture, is an important tool for fighting crime. The practice was largely ended by the Obama administration after investigations showed local police routinely stop drivers for minor traffic infractions and seize billions of dollars worth of property. In some cases, departments use the assets to pay for luxury cars and high-powered weapons. The ACLU has called civil asset forfeiture a violation of due process that disproportionately targets communities of color. On Capitol Hill, a pair of senators introduced a bill Thursday seeking to reform states' money bail systems, which leave nearly 500,000 Americans in jail each day simply because they're unable to pay their way out. The legislation by Republican Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky and Democrat Kamala Harris of California would prod states to move away from the current money bail system and towards a system that allows lower-income people to go free as they await trial. Meanwhile, in New York City, civil rights activists are demanding justice for a Bronx teenager who's been held at the notorious Rikers Island jail while awaiting trial for a 2015 crime he says he did not commit. Prosecutors say 18-year-old Pedro Hernandez fired a shot that struck another teen in the leg, even though the victim and 8 other teens who witnessed the shooting say Hernandez is innocent. Hernandez has turned down a plea deal that would see him released on 5 years probation. He's insisting on a trial by jury, but scheduling conflicts have pushed a trial date past Labor Day. Hernandez hopes to be released by September 1st in order to accept a full college scholarship. His family's launched a crowdfunding campaign to raise the $250,000 needed to bail him out. Hernandez's plight has drawn comparisons to the case of Khalif Browder, another Bronx teen who committed suicide in 2015 at the age of 22 after being held at Rikers for nearly 3 years without trial for a crime he did not commit. The Senate Thursday voted 51-47 along party lines to confirm Judge John K. Bush for a lifetime appointment to the 6th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals. Bush has a long history of homophobic and sexist comments and has compared abortion to slavery. Bush has also used a pseudonym to post right-wing blog entries denying the science of climate change and repeating the false claims of so-called birthers who say President Obama was not born in the United States. The U.S. Treasury Department has fined ExxonMobil $2 million for violating U.S. sanctions against Russia 3 years ago when Secretary of State Rex Tillerson served as the oil company's CEO. The Treasury said ExxonMobil showed reckless disregard for U.S. law in 2014 when it signed contracts with Russian oil magnate Igor Sechin to develop offshore reserves in the Arctic. The move violated sanctions placed on Russia after it invaded Ukraine and annexed the Crimean Peninsula. Tillerson said at the time his company opposed Russia's sanctions, calling them ineffective. At the State Department Thursday, spokesperson Heather Nauert was asked whether Tillerson had changed his views on Russian sanctions.
This all predates his time here at the Department of State, and so I'm going to refrain from giving any comment on that at this time.
I understand this predates his time at Secretary of State, but now he is in a position in which he is part of the team that is supposed to enforce sanctions, not violate them or allow others to violate them. So I think it's relevant to know what he thinks about this
I will say
decision
this.
today.
The Secretary continues to abide by his ethical commitments, including that recusal from Exxon-related activities.
Secretary of State Tillerson is known to have close ties to Russian President Vladimir Putin, who awarded Tillerson the country's Order of Friendship decoration in 2013. The Treasury Department's $2 million fine against ExxonMobil was the maximum amount allowed by law. It represents just over 2 hours' profit for the oil giant. In the Philippines, President Rodrigo Duterte has asked Congress to extend martial law on the southern island of Mindanao, where government forces have been battling ISIS-allied militants in the city of Marawi. The conflict has killed more than 500 people and displaced over 200,000 since fighting began in May. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., a congressional human rights panel heard testimony Thursday from activists who warn Filipino security forces and vigilantes have killed more than 7,000 suspected drug users and dealers since Duterte launched his so-called war on drugs last June. This is Elicer Carlos of the I Defend Human Rights Coalition.
Our daily documentation and monitoring work at the very affected communities confirm without a shadow of a doubt that President Duterte and other high officials of the land, having had defined a particular section of Philippine society worthy of elimination, have effectively put in place a de facto social cleansing policy whereby police and vigilantes are not only encouraged, but rewarded and forced to commit extrajudicial killings.
Congressman Jim McGovern, a Democrat from Massachusetts, said he was troubled by reports that President Duterte is planning to travel to Washington this fall for talks with President Trump.
A man with the human rights record of President Duterte should not be invited to the White House. And if he comes, I will lead the protest because, again, I mean, we ought to be on the side of advocating for human rights, not explaining them away.
In April, President Trump called Duterte, invited him to the White House. In the transcript of their conversation leaked by The Intercept, Trump said, quote, "I just wanted to congratulate you because I'm hearing of the unbelievable job on the drug problem," unquote. In Poland, thousands of protesters took to the streets of the capital, Warsaw, and other cities Thursday ahead of a vote scheduled today by the ruling Law and Justice Party on a bill that would let the Polish parliament appoint Supreme Court judges. Protesters say the measure would end the separation of powers between the executive and the judiciary.
Elections took place democratically, but their governing breaks the law, breaks the Constitution, so the democracy in Poland practically dies.
These new laws on the courts is definitely a step in the wrong direction. That is why we want the president to veto these bills.
That it was alarmed by the legislation considering bringing unprecedented sanctions against one of its member states due to potential human rights abuses. In Morocco, riot police used clubs and tear gas to scatter hundreds of people marching through the streets of Al Hoceima Thursday as they defied a government ban on demonstrations to protest corruption and underdevelopment. The protests were the largest seen in Morocco since last October, when thousands turned out in cities across Morocco after the death of a fish seller who was crushed in a garbage truck while trying to retrieve fish confiscated by police. The death became the rallying point for a wider movement for economic justice and civil liberties in Morocco. In the Mediterranean, a strong earthquake rattled parts of Turkey and Greece in the early morning hours Friday, killing at least 2 people and injuring hundreds. The 6.5 magnitude quake was centered just south of the Turkish resort town of Bodrum. It collapsed nearby buildings and sparked a small tsunami that flooded coastal communities. President Trump is set to name coal industry lobbyist Jeff Homestead as second-in-command at the Environmental Protection Agency. Since 2007, Homestead has represented coal, railroad, and utility companies as a partner at the powerful firm Bracewell LLP on K Street in Washington, D.C. Homestead is also a former staffer to Senator James Inhofe of Oklahoma, a prominent climate change denier. And in New York City, Haitian immigrant Jean Montreville walked free from a Manhattan federal building Thursday after ICE immigration officials ordered him to check in for a meeting that could have ended in his deportation. Jean Montreville came to the U.S. from Haiti with a green card in 1986 at the age of 17. Last month, when he went to his first check-in under President Trump, he was detained, handcuffed, processed to be deported until calls from his supporters apparently prompted his release. For a full interview with Jean Montreville, as well as his daughter and lawyer, you can go to DemocracyNow.org. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Civil rights groups are warning a pair of bipartisan bills targeting boycotts of Israel and Israeli settlements would criminalize free speech and peaceful protests. The Israel Anti-Boycott Act would make it a felony for U.S. citizens to support boycotts of Israel and Israeli settlements, punishable by at least a $250,000 fine with a maximum penalty of a fine of $1 million and 20 years in prison. So far, 46 senators, 31 Republican, 15 Democrat, and 234 Congress members from both sides of the aisle support the legislation. The American Israel Public Affairs Committee, known as AIPAC, reportedly helped craft the bill and has made its passage one of the group's top lobbying priorities for the year. In a letter Monday, the American Civil Liberties Union, or ACLU, urged senators to oppose the bill's passage. The ACLU wrote, quote, "We take no position for or against the effort to boycott Israel or any foreign country for that matter. However, we do assert that the government cannot, consistent with the First Amendment, punish U.S. persons based solely on their expressed political beliefs," unquote. The bill has received backing from many prominent senators on both sides of the aisle. Democrats backing the bill include Minority Leader Chuck Schumer and Kirsten Gillibrand, both of New York, as well as Ron Wyden of Oregon, Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut, and Maria Cantwell of Washington. Republican backers include Ted Cruz of Texas, Ben Sasse of Nebraska, Marco Rubio of Florida. The BDS movement was born in 2005 when a coalition of Palestinian civil society groups called for people all over the world to engage in a nonviolent campaign to boycott, divest from, and sanction Israel until it complies with international law. Their call was inspired by the international boycott and divestment initiatives applied to South Africa in the struggle to abolish apartheid. The attempt to criminalize the BDS movement comes amidst a deepening humanitarian crisis in Gaza, where Israeli-imposed restrictions continue to limit electricity to between 2 and 4 hours a day for Gaza's more than 2 million residents. Gaza's been under Israeli siege for more than a decade. In 2012, the World Health Organization warned Gaza would be uninhabitable by 2020. But now the UN says the living conditions in Gaza have deteriorated faster than expected, and the UN says the area has already become unlivable. For more, we go to Washington, D.C., where we're joined by Rabbi Joseph Berman, the Government Affairs Manager for Jewish Voice for Peace. We're also joined by Ryan Grimm, the Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief for The Intercept. His latest story, U.S. lawmakers seek to criminally outlaw support for boycott campaign against Israel. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Ryan Grimm, why don't we begin with you? Talk about the origins of this bill, who is supporting it, and where it is in Congress right now.
Right. Well, as you said, it's a huge priority of AIPAC. According to lawmakers that I've spoken to, that this has been something that they've been working on hard over the last several months. It was introduced in March and has bipartisan support. On the Democratic side, one of the things that I picked up is that Democrats seem to they took a lot of heat back at home when they for the Democrats who did end up supporting the Iran deal back under President Obama. And so this, to a lot of them, seemed like a bit of a small wake-up call. I think a make-up call. You know, the way that it was presented in the lobbying effort didn't talk about the criminal penalties that were associated with violating this statute. And so when our story came out and when the ACLU letter circulated this week, a lot of the people who had sponsored it were a bit surprised that they had actually backed something like this. They thought it was a rather simple kind of extension of a policy that had been in place for decades, merely extending it to the EU and the UN. But in fact, it comes with these, according to the ACLU, these draconian penalties. And so I think you're seeing a lot of them revisit it at this moment now that there's so much more public attention on it.
I want to turn to audio of the Intercept's interview with the Maryland Democratic Senator Ben Cardin, the bill's primary sponsor. You asked him about the ACLU's concerns about the bill.
We are very sensitive to maintain freedom of speech and expression. Nothing in our bill does it.
The ACLU says that kind of the way that it's written would lend itself towards felony penalties for people if they participated in these kind
I
of...
didn't think we had criminal sanctions in it. We go to judiciary. I don't think we have. I don't think.
Okay.
I just don't think that's in our bill. You're catching me without.
Sure.
I think I know the bill fairly well. I don't believe we have criminalized. I think our issue is U.S. participation in international organizations, speaking out against the UN actions. I think that's the bill.
So that is Maryland Democratic Senator Ben Cardin, the bill's primary sponsor. Ryan Grimm, talk about the significance of what he said.
Yeah, and then after that, I said, well, so it sounds like you don't actually support criminal penalties, associated with supporting a boycott. And he said, no, of course I don't. So that's not an exact quote, but it was something to that effect. So now that the ACLU letter has been made public and senators have had a chance to review it, I presume that a number of them are going to dial back their support for it. Ben Cardin is the author of the legislation, and the way that it's written, if you read the bill itself, the penalties aren't mentioned. You have to reference an underlying statute that it amends, and then once you get to the underlying statute, then you see the $1 million fine and the 20-year prison sentence, which the ACLU says because you've brought that underlying statute into play, that criminal statute could be brought in by a judge or a prosecutor.
So can you talk about, if they are not exactly sure what this bill is, why so many have supported it? I want to turn to Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer at the American Jewish at the AIPAC meeting.
But sometimes anti-Semitism is cloaked, hidden by certain movements that profess no bias, but suspiciously hold Israel and by extension the Jewish people to a different standard than others. There's no greater example than this insidious effort to harm the Jewish state than through the boycotts, divestment, and sanctions. The global BDS movement is a deeply biased campaign aimed at delegitimizing the Jewish state, and its supporters, sometimes wittingly, sometimes unwittingly, but all of them practice a modern form of anti-Semitism. And we have to call them out for that.
That was Chuck Schumer speaking at the American Jewish Committee's Global Forum in June. Ryan Grimm.
Right. One reason this bill may not have been read as closely as it would have otherwise is that it has become kind of a proxy for your opposition to BDS. If you're not on this bill, then you can be accused by AIPAC supporters of supporting BDS. If you're not with us, you're against us. The irony here is that it doesn't criminalize all boycotts of Israel. So if you are a neo-Nazi group, and you are driven by explicit anti-Semitism, and you call for a boycott of Israel, you would not fall under this statute. Only if you're supporting BDS through the EU or through the UN, from a pro-Palestinian perspective, would the precise same action then be criminalized. And for the ACLU, that is the definition of a First Amendment violation, because the same act becomes criminalized only based on your political motivation for carrying out that act.
Even some prominent critics of BDS have come out against the bill. In a letter to lawmakers, Dylan Williams of J Street wrote, quote, "This bill could give Attorney General Jeff Sessions the power to prosecute any American who chooses not to buy settlement products for a felony offense. That kind of authority should not be given to any administration, let alone one that has engaged in extreme rhetoric against political opponents, including threats to lock them up." Let's turn right now to Rabbi Joseph Berman of Jewish Voice for Peace. Rabbi Berman, J Street and Jewish Voice for Peace take different positions on BDS, but on this you share a position.
Thank you for having me, Amy. Good morning. This legislation is seeking to make it illegal for businesses to comply with a boycott of Israel or Israeli settlements that is supported by an international governmental organization like the United Nations. And I think it's trying to preempt what we're supposed to see in the coming months, a database from the United Nations that lists companies that are engaged in commerce in settlements, in illegal settlements in the West Bank. And we recently had a call from Amnesty International that said that third-party states like the United States or the EU should ban settlement products from coming into the country. And so it's trying to preempt actions like this. And so instead of trying to oppose the illegal and harmful settlements, right? These settlements which are incredibly destructive for Palestinians that steal their land and force them from their homes. This legislation is instead trying to shift decades of U.S. policy and understanding that settlements are illegal according to international law and according to the United States. I want to be very clear also about what this legislation is not. It would not make it illegal for activists to support the Palestinian-led call for boycott and divestment, or for activists to decide, I'm not going to buy this product from Israel or the settlements because it is connected to injustice. This legislation, as I understand it, is focused on businesses or those engaged in commerce who might comply with a boycott that comes from the United Nations or from the EU, an international governmental organization. I don't want activists out there to think, oh, if this passes, I'm going to go to jail, because there's already a chilling effect that people are scared to speak out for Palestinian human rights, and we need to continue to speak out for Palestinian human rights.
Can you talk about where this goes from here? And talk, Rabbi Joseph Berman, about why you differ so much with AIPAC on this issue and why they have made this a central campaign this year, the significance of AIPAC.
AIPAC is a very effective lobby, and I think in many ways they're not that different from something like the National Rifle Association, which keeps Congress from passing much-needed, incredibly reasonable gun control in this country. They enter into what is a very broken system, and they do a very good job at playing that system. They have immense resources, and they're very good at what they do, and so they're able to move legislation like this. I think it's important when we talk about AIPAC to say a couple of things. First of all, they don't speak for the Jewish community. Sometimes they might claim to, but they don't. The Jewish community, Jews in the United States, are incredibly diverse and on many ways, and especially when it comes to relationships to and views on Israel-Palestine. And so they're not representative of American Jews, even though they might have a lot of influence. And at the same time, they are able to move this forward. I think that it's incumbent on us to have to provide a counterweight. We need to change the calculus for members of Congress so that they're not going to support legislation like this. And so if you haven't already, call the Capitol Switchboard, call your member of Congress in the House of Representatives, in the Senate, tell them to oppose the legislation if it comes to a vote, to not co-sponsor if they're co-sponsoring. Tell them they need to take their names off of the legislation.
I want to turn to Vice President Mike Pence speaking this week at the Christians United for Israel Summit in Washington, D.C.
With the support and prayers of men and women gathered in this room, I'm proud to say in my last year as governor, it was my great privilege to sign one of the strongest anti-BDS laws in America to ensure that our state never does business with those who seek to inflict financial damage on Israel. Because boycott, divestment, and sanctions have no place in my home state and no place in America.
That's Mike Pence addressing the Christians United for Israel Summit in Washington, D.C. Ryan Grimm, can you talk about this group and what Vice President Pence just said?
Right. It's an organization that is kind of pushing for boycotts of the boycotters. So New York State has pushed in a similar direction, that trying to say that, okay, if you agree to participate in the BDS movement, then we're not going to buy products from you. So that you must purchase products from the occupied territories if you want to do business here in the state of Indiana, or you don't necessarily have to, but you just have to be quiet about it. And that's one of the things that the ACLU was also deeply concerned about. That nobody, of course, is forced to do business with Israeli companies in the occupied territories. But if you say that you're not doing business there, because you object to the political circumstances, then all of a sudden you're getting caught up in the statute here, or you'd get caught up in this Indiana law. Whereas if you were just quiet about it and kept your opinions to yourself, then you're not in any legal or commercial trouble, and that is kind of the definition of a freedom of speech issue.
In April, Democracy Now! Spoke with Palestinian human rights defender Omar Barghouti, co-founder of the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions National Committee. He talked about Israel's efforts at home and abroad to target the BDS movement.
Since 2014, Israel decided that its former strategy for fighting BDS, the propaganda or brand Israel strategy, was failing. So they adopted a new strategy that is based on using their intelligence services to spy on BDS activists and try to tarnish our reputations, based on legal warfare, trying to pass anti-BDS legislation, as is happening in many state legislatures in this country, as well as in the US Congress and in countries like France, Britain, and so on. So they've gone from a propaganda war to a full-fledged legal and intelligence war on the movement. What you mentioned is absolutely important. Recently, Israel passed an anti-BDS ban. It wouldn't allow any supporter of BDS or even supporters of partial boycotts against Israel's illegal settlements in the occupied territories from entering the country. They are establishing, indeed, a blacklist of Israelis who support any form of boycott against Israeli institutions to bring about justice and to bring about Palestinian rights. So this McCarthyism is no longer just a metaphor. It's really, truly happening as Israel descends into the abyss, and as people in the mainstream, as Ehud Barak, for example, are warning that there are signs of fascism taking over in Israel.
So that's Omar Barghouti, co-founder of the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions National Committee, speaking when he was in New York. Rabbi Joseph Berman, your final comment on this.
I'm concerned about this legislation. We need to fight it and oppose it. And what I'm really concerned about is something that you mentioned earlier, Amy, and that is what's happening with the people in Gaza right now who only have a few, maybe 4 hours of electricity a day. There is an incredible shortage of drinkable water. There's a very, very high level of food insecurity and just immense suffering that is happening right now in Gaza. And that is because of the siege that is led by Israel with the support of Egypt. And so there needs to be an end to that siege. And what we need to see is we need to see equality and human rights and dignity for Palestinians and Israelis. I personally care deeply for the freedom and liberation of Palestinians, and that's what we're struggling for and need to continue to struggle for, and care deeply, love my fellow Jewish sisters and brothers, and want them also to be safe. And so I want to see that safety for Palestinians and Israelis. And the conditions, having equality and human rights and dignity that can lead us to a just and lasting peace.
Rabbi Joseph Berman, I want to thank you for being with us of Jewish Voice for Peace. Ryan Grimm, please stay with us, D.C. Bureau Chief for The Intercept. Coming up, a special counsel, Robert Mueller, is expanding his probe to look at President Trump's business activities, as well as those of his associates, including his son-in-law, Jared Kushner. You've done a piece on how Jared Kushner tried and failed to get a $500 million bailout from Qatar. Could that failed deal be influencing how Trump said he was responsible for helping to isolate Qatar from the other Gulf nations? Stay with us.
I ain't got no home, I'm just a roaming round, just a wandering worker. I go from town to town, and the police make it hard for me no matter where I go. And I ain't got no home in this world anymore. No, I ain't got no home in this world anymore. My brothers and my sisters are stranded on this road, long and dusty road that 1,000,000 feet have trod. Now the rich man took my home and drove me from my door, and I ain't got no home in this world anymore.
I ain't got No Home by Billy Bragg, singing here at our Democracy Now! Studios in 2011. You can check it all out at DemocracyNow.org. I am Amy Goodman. This is Democracy Now! Bloomberg is reporting special counsel Robert Mueller has expanded his probe of President Trump beyond possible collusion with Russia. Mueller is reportedly looking at Trump's business activities as well as those of his associates, including his son-in-law, Jared Kushner. According to Bloomberg, investigators are interested in Kushner's attempts to secure financing for some of his family's real estate properties. Our guest, Ryan Grimm of The Intercept, recently co-wrote a piece there, headlined, "Jared Kushner Tried and Failed to Get a $500 million Bailout from Qatar." The article reveals Kushner and his father, Charles, negotiated directly with billionaire and former Qatar Prime Minister Sheikh Hamad bin Jassim Al Thani to refinance their property at 666 Fifth Avenue here in New York. Throughout 2015 and 2016, Kushner sought a $500 million loan from the Qatari investor to save the property. After promising talks, the deal fell through. The story was published as Qatar remains embroiled in a major diplomatic dispute with its Gulf neighbors, including Saudi Arabia. President Trump sided with Saudi Arabia. According to The Intercept, Kushner played a key behind-the-scenes role in hardening the U.S. posture toward Qatar. Ryan Grimm, you have written extensively about this. Talk about what you uncovered.
Right. So a little background. President Trump went to Saudi Arabia this spring. Shortly after that, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and some other Gulf countries blockaded and isolated Qatar. And immediately Donald Trump took credit for that. He said, I pushed them. I suggested that they take a hard line against the country. He hasn't been totally consistent about where he stands on that, but that was his initial play. Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, was trying to broker an end to this blockade, and Jared Kushner, Tillerson believes, played a back-channel role to go directly to President Trump to say, no, we need to take a hard line against the country. So what we uncovered is that he may have reasons for having some animosity there. For the last year, as you said, he was trying to secure a $500 million investment into this property on Fifth Avenue that is deeply underwater. The Kushner companies, it was a kind of a high-flying investment. It made a huge splash when they jumped into it in 2007. Couldn't have been timed worse. They dramatically overpaid. The Kushner company's investment of $500 million seems to be entirely wiped out, according to a New York Times kind of look at the current value of the property. So the Qataris said, okay, we'll give you a $500 million if you can find the rest of the financing elsewhere. He went to China. That blew up when it became public, and around that time, the Qataris said, well, it doesn't look like you're going to get the rest of the investment, so we're not able to go forward at this time. And then just weeks later, you have this blockade, and so you have to ask the uncomfortable question of, well, what if they had made the investment? Would the Trump administration still be taking such a hard line against Qatar, or will other investors see it as retaliation for not coming forward with what otherwise would have been what most people in the industry see as a really bad investment?
So, of course, this meeting in Saudi Arabia led to a number of different developments. So one of the largest weapons deals in the history of the United States with Saudi Arabia. Jared Kushner was there, also apparently close to the son of the king, who ultimately is in charge of the absolutely devastating war that Saudi Arabia is waging with U.S. support in Yemen. All of this coming together as President Trump and Jared Kushner and others, Rex Tillerson as well, went to Saudi Arabia. And when they came out, President Trump himself claiming credit for the isolating of Qatar by the Gulf countries, seemingly going against his own Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, who was bringing together the forces, he said, went back to Saudi Arabia and Qatar, supposedly to bring these countries together.
Right, and the go-between for all of this is the UAE ambassador to the United States, who is very close to Kushner. His name's Yusuf Al-Otaiba. This is this is somebody who's been pushing a very hard line against Qatar in Washington D.C. for years now. What the U.S. intelligence community has since leaked to the Washington Post is that the thing that the Gulf countries used to launch this blockade, which were some comments posted online and attributed to the Emir of Qatar, were in fact put there by a UAE hacking operation. Immediately after these comments from the Emir appeared, where he was kind of praising Iran and being a little bit rough with the United States, the Qatari news service said, we were hacked. These are not real comments. We withdraw them. We don't know what happened. We're investigating how this happened. The Emir never said these words. Now, according to U.S. intelligence sources, it was actually the UAE that organized the hack of Qatar to post these inflammatory comments, which the UAE and Saudi Arabia then took umbrage at, launching this blockade that was supported by President Trump. And like I said, Otaiba and Kushner are well known to be close allies, and Tillerson believes that Otaiba actually wrote the statement that Trump read, delivered it to Kushner, and Kushner delivered it to Donald Trump.
Before we go, and in the next segment, we're going to be talking about Jared Kushner's wife, President Trump's daughter, Ivanka Trump, and her own businesses, not in this country, but in Indonesia, where Ivanka brand clothes are manufactured. I wanted to ask you, Ryan Grim, about what's happening with the health care debate on Capitol Hill. You cover all developments in Congress closely. This week, of course, the massive news, Republican Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said the Senate will vote next week on whether to repeal the Affordable Care Act without a replacement, even though the bill currently lacks enough Republican support to pass. McConnell's announcement came after President Trump invited all 52 Republican senators to the White House for lunch aimed at reviving stalled efforts on health care. This is what he said.
There is a large majority in our conference that want to demonstrate to the American people that they intend to keep the commitment they made in 4 straight elections to repeal Obamacare. I think we all agree it's better to both repeal and replace. But we could have a vote on either.
Can you talk about the latest developments? It seemed like it was over at this point. And then after the lunch, when President Trump said, we're going to revive this, you're going to sign it, I'm waiting, I'm going to sign it, I'm waiting here with pen in hand. What's happening right now? Do you believe this bill is dead?
Yes, it is over. This is theater at this point. And if you look closely at what McConnell said, he said a large majority of people in our conference, they only have, with John McCain in Arizona and not able to vote, they have 51 people in their conference. So that's one more than they need to have the actual majority, because Mike Pence can break the votes. So, but what he said is they have a majority within their conference. So, in other words, they don't have a majority within the Senate, which is what you need. So what he's saying they're going to do is they're going to open debate on health care reform, and then they're going to present 2 options. For the people that want some kind of a replacement bill, they can vote for that. For people that want to just simply repeal it straight up, they can vote for that instead. So that allows them to get to an actual vote, which McConnell believes is cathartic and is a necessary step to put this to rest. As the House learned that when they pulled their bill and never had a vote, it felt anticlimactic. And the kind of grassroots activists were demanding some action. And so they put together a bill in the House that was never really intended to become law. It was just paper that enough Republicans could sign on to and then punt over to the Senate, where they knew it would fail. And so this is an effort to just put people on record and say, here, you had a chance to vote. Look, we had 40-some for this, we had 40-some for that. We don't have enough for either. Now we're moving on. But because Trump continues to insist on all of this theater, he has burned through weeks and weeks where he could have been doing tax reform or infrastructure or any other part of his agenda. You know, we're getting close to August, and he's still on this when we've known for months that it didn't have the vote.
Ryan Grim, I want to thank you for being with us, Bureau Chief for The Intercept. We'll link to your latest piece, U.S. lawmakers seek to criminally outlaw support for boycott campaign against Israel, and your other pieces. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, it's Made in America Week.
In my Blakeian year, I was so disposed toward a mission yet unclear, advancing pole by pole. Fashion breathed into my ears, obey the simple code. When road was paved in gold.
My Blakeian Year by Patti Smith, singing here at Democracy Now! Studios in 2015. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. It's Made in America Week, according to the White House. This is President Trump speaking earlier this week.
We're here today to celebrate American manufacturing and to showcase the amazing products from all 50 states made in the USA. Remember in the old days, they used to have made in the USA, made in America, but made in the USA. We're going to start doing that again. We're going to put that brand on our product because it means it's the best. We want to build, create, and grow more products in our country using American labor, American goods, and American grit. When we purchase products made in the USA, the profits stay here, the revenue stays here, and the jobs, maybe most importantly of all, they stay right here in the USA.
While President Trump's promoting Made in the America Week, we turn now to look at a recent investigation by The Guardian that revealed workplace abuse, grueling production targets, and deplorably low pay at an Indonesian factory that makes clothing for the Ivanka Trump brand label. Many of the female workers at the factory in West Java say the pay is so low they live in constant debt and can't afford to live with their own children. This comes as 3 Chinese activists with the group China Labor Watch were imprisoned, though now released, after they were arrested while investigating labor conditions at a factory manufacturing Ivanka Trump brand shoes in China. Well, last month, we spoke to the journalist who broke the story, Krithika Varagur, in Jakarta, Indonesia's capital. She talked about what she discovered in her investigation.
I went to a factory in West Java, about 3 hours from Jakarta, that makes clothes for G3 Apparel Group, which is this global conglomerate that makes clothes for a bunch of high-profile brands, including Calvin Klein, Karl Lagerfeld, and Ivanka Trump. What I found there was fairly typical of other Indonesian garment factories, which is to say there were quite a few labor violations, according to the workers that I spoke with. Including consistent unpaid overtime or poorly compensated overtime, an extremely low minimum wage, still legal, I wanted to emphasize that, but quite low for Indonesia and quite low for Asia, and reports of verbal abuse from company management.
And talk about the people you met there, particularly the young women, and what they had to say about their work conditions.
Yeah, so this is a pretty large factory, almost 3,000 people, and the vast majority of people who work there are women, and often they are the breadwinners for their whole family. The fact about this minimum wage and the reason this town has become quite attractive to garment factories is that this minimum wage is incredibly low, even for Indonesia. It's about $173 a month. And this means that if you're from out of town, which is to say if your parents don't have a house here that you can stay in, you basically can't afford to have your children live with you. According to many labor activists, this is not a living wage. One prominent activist that I quoted called it a poverty wage. And the working moms that I met, including the one that was prominently featured in my piece, simply can't afford to have their kids live with them. They live in a different town with their grandparents and see their parents about once a month.
You talk about this area being where this factory is, being particularly low wages, even for Indonesia. What, like you said, $160 a month, which would be, what, $40 a week, which would be well under $1 an hour. Because also, you describe people saying they're forced to work overtime and not be compensated.
Right. This wage is quite low for Indonesia. In a neighboring town, for example, Purwakarta in West Java, the minimum wage is over 3 million rupiah, whereas here it's only 2.3. When I spoke to the manpower ministry of this district, they were quite insistent that this wage was important to keep them competitive in the global garment market. But of course, when you look at it from the global perspective, this wage is about 40% lower than what the equivalent factory workers are making in China. And it was reported earlier this month in the New York Times that the G3 Apparel Group was looking to move to cheaper labor, even cheaper than China, and had been closing down some of its factories. So you see this downstream movement chasing lower and lower wages, which I think this is a part of.
And that issue of China is particularly relevant when it comes to Ivanka Trump brand clothes. We just reported on the 3 investigators for China Labor Watch who went to a factory in China, which actually pays more than the factory you visit in Indonesia. They were investigating the conditions there, and they've all been arrested, which is unusual even for China right now.
Yeah, it's certainly concerning. And I believe that the Ivanka Trump brand has distanced itself from that particular factory because they don't currently produce things there anymore. I would say it's a disturbing development.
Talk to us about Aaliyah, the young woman you met in the West Java factory.
Yeah, without giving too much away, she's been working all her life. She's a mother to 2 children, and what I would emphasize is that she is not unique within the factory. She said there's dozens of moms just like her whose main interactions with their kids are in photos on their phone that they store up when they visit them once a month. And, you know, they're doing honest work. They're getting a legal wage, and this factory is not beyond the pale. It's a very, you know, ordinary Indonesian factory. But the fact is, even working day after day, the money they make is simply not enough. And there's just a great distance from the lives these women live, these working moms live, and the professional rhetoric of Ivanka Trump, who wrote a book on women in the workplace.
Now, you actually shared the sort of gist of the book, Ivanka Trump's book, Women Who Work, Rewriting the Rules for Success, with this young woman, this factory worker at the West Java factory. What did she say about what Ivanka recommends when it comes to rewriting the rules for success?
I mean, she thought it was funny. She just started laughing. This work-life balance rhetoric is totally alien to women of her class in their position, and they don't balance their work and lives because they want to, but because they have to. And yeah, I mean, there's just a huge gap between their lived experience and the rhetoric that's being pushed in Ivanka Trump's book. So they thought it was pretty funny. She and many of them did know who she was, but they weren't familiar with the intricacies of her brand and so forth.
So she can't see her children but once a month when she travels, makes enough money for the gasoline to go hours away to her family, where her children are being raised by their grandparents.
That's correct.
You also talk about President Trump calling out Indonesia last March for having an unfavorable trade balance with the United States, saying that Indonesia was cheating foreign importers. Can you explain how that fits into this picture?
Sure. Indonesia is one of the countries that Donald Trump singled out for having what he called an unfair trade balance with the United States. I believe as of last year, it was a $13 billion surplus, and he promised to correct that, as it were, and return jobs and the import-export balance in America's favor. So it's ironic in that context that, having singled out Indonesia as one of these countries, his daughter's clothing brand uses Indonesian labor.
And Donald Trump keeps on saying he will penalize companies that go to other countries, talking about bringing jobs back to America. Now, this company, Ivanka Trump's brand, you don't always know that it is the Ivanka Trump brand. Is that right? The name is different, and they've even changed the Ivanka Trump brand name in some cases.
That's correct. It's been sort of plummeting in popularity in various metro areas in recent months, to the point where G3, which is the apparel group that owns Ivanka Trump, has been discreetly relabeling her merchandise to a brand called Adrian Vittadini, apparently without informing Ivanka Trump's brand, in hopes of moving it off the shelves. Not sure what the effects of that have been, but I think it points to the fact that her merchandise is kind of getting tougher to move off the shelves.
Indonesia is the largest Muslim country in the world. Did you talk to the workers at this factory? Were they aware of all the controversy around the Muslim ban 1 and 2 of the current president, President Trump, the father of Ivanka Trump, whose clothes are named after her, though she's distanced herself while she is an advisor to her father in the White House?
Yeah, certainly some of them were aware of Donald Trump, and for obvious reasons, since almost every worker in this factory is a Muslim, they were not fans of him. But this factory town, like many other factory towns in Indonesia, is a one-horse town. You either keep this job or you work on the farm. So like one of the people quoted in my article said, they are not in a position to make employment decisions based on their principles. So as much as they have personal problems with indirectly supporting a family that has announced a Muslim ban, they can't do much about it right now.
Have you gotten a response from the Ivanka Trump brand? The publisher of Ivanka Trump's book, Adrian Zackheim, told ABC News in a statement, "The book highlights the author's continuing commitment to inspire and empower women to define success on their own terms and to create the lives they want to live." Have they responded directly to your piece and expose about the conditions in this one plant in Indonesia that makes Ivanka Trump brand clothes?
No, not yet.
Is there anything else you'd like to add about what you found and how people in the plant feel? This is a non-union plant?
There are 2 small unions represented, but they are quite a small fraction of the total factory population. So they're less than 10% of the factory.
And are many of the factories in Indonesia, are there a number that are going to this Subang district of Indonesia where the minimum wage, which to say the least is extremely minimal, is even lower than other parts of Indonesia?
Yeah, there are quite a few Korean apparel groups in this region, and there are, I think, over 300 companies in Subang as of this year. It's become quite, it's becoming a semi-prominent industrial zone within the last 2 decades after spending a long time as an agrarian community. And in terms of the factory as a whole, I would just say it is a very run-of-the-mill Indonesian garment factory. But of course, the reason that it bears a second look is because of the connection to a very specific brand that is built on women in the workplace. So I think it's important to look at the supply chain of a brand that positions itself in that way.
To Indonesia about her Guardian investigation revealed reality of life working in an Ivanka Trump clothing factory. We'll link to that at democracynow.org. All Ivanka Trump brand apparel are made abroad. President Trump declared this week Made in America Week. And that does it for the broadcast. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Laura Gottesdiener, Sam Alcoff, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Hani Massoud, Sharina Nadura, and Andre Lewis. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.